On today's episode, y'all, we are going to get into it. We are going to get down to the questions that you can ask yourself, ways you can prepare, and things to ask your therapist as well, too, because it's a two-way street here, y'all. Like, yes, you're going to get the help and to get the guidance that you need, but at the same time, you're also looking for someone who can give you that in return as well, too. So let's get into the questions. Earlier, if y'all been watching my Instagram or on my TikTok, there was a couple questions that I posed to you all, and I am just going to pick out some of the questions that come up pretty often for people when they are preparing to go to therapy or when you're thinking about going to therapy, or just some things that could come up along the way as they're trying to get into their healing journey. So the first question that I got was, when should you go to therapy? Now, y'all, as a therapist, I'm going to always say you need to go to therapy, right? So I'm going to always say that whether it's a 7-year-old child, whether it's a 5-year-old child, or whether you're a teenager, or whether you're just going through a recent transition, whether that's a divorce, a breakup, moving to a new city, or if you recently went through a sudden loss of a family member or friend or a loved one, I'm going to encourage for you all to go to therapy, right? There's not necessarily like a right or wrong time of when you should go to therapy. It's just something that I encourage everyone to do. I always say that there's so much that goes on in a day that you probably should just be going to therapy, right? And of course, when we talk about trauma versus going through a difficult time, maybe it's time for you to go to therapy, right? But in all seriousness, if we were to create a formula of when it may be appropriate for someone to go to therapy, maybe when you're noticing that your life doesn't feel the same, you're not showing up in relationships how you want to, or you're noticing that you're not able to reach your goals or amount to the things that you set out to do for whatever reason, I'm going to encourage you to go to therapy. Those can be the very signs that you may need to get back to your true sense of self and to also figure out what's coming up for you that's preventing you to get to that point. So always go to therapy is what I would encourage. But know your signs, right? Know what feels right, what doesn't feel right, and listen to yourself. And know that there is a better way of life. There is a better way in which you could be showing up. And maybe a behavioral health professional can help you get to that point. So now that we talked about that question, let's talk about preparing for the first appointment, because oftentimes for someone who is a therapist and someone who has been on the other side of the couch, I encourage preparation, because in life we got to prepare for a lot of things. So prepare for therapy. So what I have seen that has been helpful for me, and what I have seen has also been helpful for clients, is coming in with goals, right? Come up with some goals that you want for yourself before you go to therapy. But know that if you don't have goals in mind, that's okay too, because your therapist is there to help guide you and support you through that process. And sometimes your therapist can help you kind of map out those goals too. That's part of our job, y'all. So another thing that I would say in regards to preparing for therapy is come up with your own timeline, right? You know your life. You've been with you since birth. So you may know where your starting point may be, but even if you don't, your therapist can help you find that out too, right? And also come up with some questions that you want to ask your therapist. Sometimes you can do this in the initial consultation. An initial consultation is just where you don't get charged, but you're just kind of interviewing your therapist, seeing if they do have the qualifications and expertise to meet you where you are, right? But of course, with that first session, some therapists is kind of different, because some people will have an hour session and that's just your initial session. But if some therapists have an hour and 30-minute session, and in that hour and 30 minutes, or in that hour, I encourage you just to lay it all out there, right? Show up how you want to show up, right? Be authentic in what you are feeling. Be transparent about what your experiences are. That space is your space, and your therapist is there to just be with you in that space, to guide you in that space, but also provide you with some techniques or just reframing how you're thinking about things. But as therapists, we don't know that unless you all tell us what your experiences are, right? So I encourage, be honest about your experience. Do not try to sugarcoat for your therapist, or go in there as if everything is okay and that you got it worked out and this is not, because to us, what that looks like is, okay, well, why are you really here? But for a true therapist who knows and has seen this before, that also gives us an idea that there's more that needs to be unpacked as well too. But of course, go to therapy, y'all. Try it out. Now, another question that came up was the myths about therapy and mental health, right? So this didn't necessarily come up as a question, but I saw that it came up as a topic, and we may have to tackle this another time because there are a lot of myths about therapy. There's a lot of myths about mental health, but the one that I see in particular is what I see that come up very often is people assume that, well, they'll just go to 1, 2, or 5 sessions and everything will be resolved. Well, I'm here to tell y'all that that is not necessarily the case. Is it possible? Maybe. But is it common? Not necessarily, right? Let's put it like this. You spent a lot of time in your day-to-day, and you may have also experienced trauma or depression. And those are things that just doesn't necessarily happen overnight. So to assume that, or to believe that it'll take 1 to 5 sessions for things to be resolved, that may not be realistic, depending on what you want to work on, right? But there are some therapists out there that does provide brief therapy, and they can further explain that to you because everyone practices differently. But I encourage people to be very open when they go into therapy. Be very clear about what you want to work on and where you are, right? When you come to therapy, I encourage people to not to think about it as if you're shortchanging yourself, right? Meaning that like you're talking yourself out of actually doing the work and being in your process, right? Kind of like going back to the original point that I made, when we see celebrities, social media influencers, or just anyone talk about their trauma, they're speaking about it from a healed place. So we don't know the amount of time that it took them to get to that point. We just know that it looks good, it feels good, and they're not crying when they're telling the story, right? And so what I'm encouraging you all to do is just to give yourself some time to really get to that healed place, right? Don't count the sessions, but I understand we got to count finances, but just take into account like what you may be needing and the time it may take to get there. But be patient with yourself. So another question that I got was, what is the purpose of therapy? Great question. So the purpose of therapy definitely varies for everyone, right? The purpose of therapy could be to go and solve one particular problem, if you know what that is. Purpose of therapy could be to incorporate it in your overall lifestyle. Some people look at therapy like they're going to their doctor's appointment for their physical health. They try to incorporate the two, right? And if that's what you do, that's your thing, then more power to you. Some people look at therapy as if they kind of just want to focus on a variety of things, right? Life be lifing, things be happening, and just to have someone there to support them as they go through that. Maybe that could be like from a 6-month to a year type of relationship that you have with your therapist, right? But I say all this to say is that therapy varies for everyone, right? The purpose of therapy can just be just about anything. It just depends on what you're going and what led you there. So how often should I be going to therapy? Now, you have to ask your therapist on this one. And the reason why I say that is because sometimes when it comes to therapy, you can start off meeting with your therapist every week. Some people meet with their therapist twice a week. If your finances allow it, then I encourage you to go to therapy as often as you may be needing support, right? But at the same time, there are some therapists that will start to kind of wean you off of therapy, meaning that you've been doing really good. You've probably been, knocking out some of your goals. And that's amazing. Like, especially when you're noticing your own progress and your therapist is like cheering you along the way as well too, then that probably means that they're going to start scaling back some of your appointments where you're not going weekly, but you're going bi-weekly. Now, if you start to notice that you're meeting with your therapist monthly, then you got your own routine going. Like, you're at a point to where you're flowing. You're at a point to where you're probably thriving as well too. And those monthly appointments can just be check-ins, right? But some people just like to have their therapist around. So, or just to have their therapist there as they are just continuously progressing through life. So if you like to meet with your therapist every other month or every 6 months, then that is something that you got to talk to your therapist about, right? But in terms of how often you should go to therapy, I encourage people to be very honest about the level of support that they are needing. Okay, so the next question that we got was, What if I don't like my therapist? Okay, this is an interesting question, y'all. The reason for that is because, yes, sometimes when you do go through the process of finding a therapist, it's almost it can feel like speed dating almost. But what I do encourage is that if you're noticing that you and your therapist are not hitting it off, then this is where I'm going to encourage you to start to reflect with yourself and ask yourself some questions, right? What are they doing that you don't like, right? Are they disagreeing with you? Is there biases entering into the room? Are they talking more than you're talking? Like, what is coming up for you to not like your therapist? And a question that I am going to encourage you to ask yourself is, did you tell them what they're doing that is bothering you, right? That can sound a little bit confrontational, but at the same time, therapists don't know what they don't know, right? So if you are noticing that your therapist is cutting you off or they're saying something that you don't like, then I encourage for you to address that in the room with them, because therapists aren't perfect, right? And therapy isn't perfect. It's going to ebb and flow. There may be some sessions where you leave out and you're feeling amazing. And then there may be some sessions where you leave and you're feeling horrible, right? That's just a part of the process, y'all. That's the part of the process that a lot of people don't talk about, because with therapy, it does ebb and flow, just like how you're ebbing and flowing in life. But if you're noticing that it's been 5, 6 sessions and something is just you're not getting what you're needing, then of course I'm going to encourage you to go a little bit more and have that difficult conversation with your therapist. It may not be difficult at all, right? Because as therapists, we are used to those type of things. We're used to those responses. And it is not our job for you all to like us or for you all to want to be friends with us. We are still professionals at the end of the day, right? And as professionals and human beings, we do get it wrong sometimes. So if you notice that you are not necessarily enjoying your experience and you've tried and you had this tough conversation with your therapist, then by all means, I encourage you to go and find another therapist. But I do understand that process can be very tiring and it can sometimes be disheartening. And I do notice that it can kind of be difficult to find that therapist that you're vibing with and who's understanding. So I get that. Now, the next question that y'all asked was, should I find a therapist of color or a Black therapist? Because I've had other therapists in the past who were very biased, and it just seems like their bias entered into the room. Okay, y'all. So as a Black therapist, I'm not sure, I can't speak about other therapists' experience. I can only speak about mine. But what I do know is that as a Black therapist, I do often get clients who are very relieved to have another Black person sitting across from them where they can talk about their problems. I'm not sure what their experiences were, but that comes up for people sometimes. And honestly, as a therapist who has therapists, sometimes having a person of color or someone who comes from the same race or ethnicity, it does make a difference sometimes. But of course, I definitely would encourage you to just lean in and seeing, like, what are you valuing about that relationship that you are having with your therapist? What does she bring into the space, not only for professional, but as well as like their own insight, right? In terms of what they may be experiencing and how they're relating to you or guiding you through your process. Someone asked another question of, how would I go about firing my therapist? Okay, y'all. So y'all asking some really messy questions, but these are good questions. Okay. So if you ever want to fire your therapist, by all means, it doesn't have to be like this long, drawn out thing of you breaking up with your therapist. Some things just don't work out, and that's okay. Because at the end of the day, this is about your process. This is about your mental health, and this is about you getting what you need. So if that relationship isn't working, then you could either write a letter, an email, or just simply let your therapist know that you just decided to continue services elsewhere. Now, if it's on your heart to give that feedback as to why, then yes, you can so give that. But if you just kind of just want to move on and just find another therapist, that's okay too, right? As long as you are prioritizing what you need and you're listening to yourself And as a therapist, a Black therapist especially, I always encourage people to listen to their what is it? Your intuition, and to lean into that, because if you know what you need and you know the type of care that you're looking for, then so be it, go find that, right? But do not stop looking is what I would encourage. So another question that y'all came up with is, how would I correct my therapist if he or she made a wrong judgment or a wrong comment about my life? Okay, so y'all, this goes back to therapists not being perfect, right? Now, when I'm in the room or when I'm being a therapist and I'm the one that's in the chair, I give out a disclaimer letting people know that, hey, I may not get this right. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? But that's because I've been doing this for quite a while and I love feedback. I love, people correcting me. And honestly, most therapists love to be corrected, right? Correct us, y'all, if we get it wrong. We are not y'all, right? We don't know what you're experiencing, but we're trying to be there with you as you are processing what you're experiencing, right? So in moments in which your therapist may be making a comment, or she made a statement, or she assumed something, or she's saying that it appears that it's this way, or it seems like it's this, y'all, it's okay to say, no, that's not it, right? Feel comfortable in doing that, right? That's a part of the whole therapist and client relationship. The more that you can do that with your therapist, the more you could do that outside of therapy and see the true changes that you want to see. Okay? All right, so another question that y'all came up with was, how would I know to stop going to therapy? Well, that would be a question I would encourage you to ask your therapist as well, too. Sometimes when you're going to therapy, you could just kind of like the relationship. You kind of like just coming into the room and sitting on the couch. Like, that feels good. But sometimes you notice that you may be coming in and you're talking about the same thing, or you're coming in and you're just kind of reflecting and just sharing all the good, or you're just coming in and you're noticing that you're doing most of the talking and your therapist just saying, good, okay. And so those are all good signs that maybe it is time for you to leave therapy. You're able to speak from things from a healed place. You got to the point to where you're on the other side of things. And you also got to the point to where you can do the reflection and you can do I would say, the self-correction. And sometimes by going to therapy, your therapist can continue to encourage you. They can continue to validate you. They can continue to be understanding. But it's essentially up to you. If you've gotten to the point to where you're developing like those skills on your own and you're doing pretty good in life, and you just kind of want to have your therapist there to check in every now and then maybe you're at that month-to-month mark. But at the same time, I definitely would encourage you to challenge yourself, right? See where you are. Talk to your therapist about this transition as well, too. Because you could be at the point to where maybe you don't need to go to therapy anymore. But, of course, check in with your therapist. Okay? Now let's see another question y'all asked here, because y'all asked some really good questions. I like these. Okay, so another question that y'all asked about therapy was, this one is kind of related to trauma, right? So as a trauma therapist, sometimes people come in and there's like I would say a cloud of trauma. And when I say a cloud of trauma, I'm kind of getting into my EMDR. Everyone who knows EMDR, it is eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy. So what that essentially is that the way I look at trauma as a Black therapist is that I'm looking at trauma like almost in a cloud. Like, yes, there's something that you've experienced, but then because of that experience, there may be a certain way in which you perceive yourself or that you may be perceiving life. And because of that, right, of how you're perceiving yourself in life, there may be other experiences that are tied to that. So it kind of creates like a cloud. But the center of that cloud is you. And it could be like either a direct trauma, right, or a direct memory of that trauma that it's kind of like tying it all together. So I encourage people to break their trauma up by either timelines or by either events or people, or because, people can be peopling, and then, or just break your trauma up in a way that makes sense to you, right? And when you do come into your first session, if you want to do trauma work, when you do come into your first session, then have it mapped out. Sometimes your therapist can help you map it out as well too, but map it out. Try to identify like how your trauma is making you feel, especially if you're breaking it down into certain events or people, if you're breaking it down into a timeline, because there could be a series of things that could be taking place, but they could be making you feel differently, and they can make you have different beliefs about yourself or about the world. So if you are looking to do trauma therapy or trauma work or inner child work, then I definitely encourage you to break it down into categories that make sense for you. So the last question that I'll go through with you all is another question about trauma therapy, because I feel like we talked about depression. I feel like we kind of talked a little bit about the anxiety of going to therapy, but let's also talk about trauma therapy. So this is the last question. So the last question asks, when I am looking to do either inner childhood trauma work or just trauma therapy work, how would I get back involved in therapy if I stopped going? So my question to you in that, right, if this comes up for anyone, right, because sometimes people start and stop therapy, but first I would definitely encourage you to consider why you stop going to therapy, right? And this is related to trauma, and this could be unrelated to trauma, right? If you notice yourself stopping and starting, then I encourage you to ask yourself why, right? What's making you stop going to therapy? Is it the emotions? Is it a lot going on financially? Is it just too much to take on, right, at once? And if that's the case, hey, we all operate from different coping mechanisms all the time. And it's okay to give yourself that break if you are needing that break, right? But at the same time, I encourage you, stay connected with your therapist. Let them know where you are. Let them know what you're needing or what is feeling unbearable or too much. So I hope y'all enjoyed today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. This was Me, Myself, and Healing. I am Alexis, licensed clinical social worker and mental health therapist. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you all are keeping yourself in mind. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and comment. And Me, Myself, and Healing is a reflection of how healing can lead you back to your true sense of self. See you next time.